So I like to start by telling you a little bit of my story around screen time and gaming. And I mentioned a little bit about this in the introduction to this webinar. Basically, I didn't know anything at all about video games until my son turned 6, which is when he went to a friend's house and got introduced to a game being played. I think it was on a PlayStation. And that was basically like my first introduction to video gaming. And that was, well, when would have been like 12 years ago now. So I'd had a very sheltered background in relation to this. I'd always had limited screen time when I was growing up. Excuse me. And I grew up in a family that really stressed academic learning as the most important thing above everything else. Academic learning and getting outside and being sporty and being in nature. So those were the things that were considered important in my family, and that's really what had been programmed into my mind. That the things that were important were kids getting outside, being physically active, playing sport, being in nature, and then also being academically oriented and learning, reading and writing and enjoying books and all sorts of things like that. And that's really not how things turned out with my children. In fact, it couldn't have been further away in some respects to my own childhood, because they were introduced to gaming and to screens. Obviously, there was television in their lives before they discovered video gaming, and the television had been very popular pastime, but that was nothing compared to how excited my eldest son was when he discovered gaming. He was just beside himself with excitement. He so much wanted to engage with video games and to play and to explore and to level up his skills and play with friends and try new games. And he was super, super excited about it. And we bought him a PlayStation for his 6th birthday, and it just sort of took off from there. And probably about a year after that, his younger brother, who was then only about 3, had started joining him and playing as well. And I certainly at that stage had judgments around gaming. I had judgments based on my own upbringing. I was judging this as somewhat mindless activity. You know, I didn't see any real learning or benefit in it at that point. It was keeping my kids out indoors, whereas I thought they should be more outdoors. I'd always had limited screen time, and my kids were really wanting to have a lot of time playing games. So I was judging it as a really not very worthwhile activity. I didn't really judge it as damaging at that point, but that was sort of the beginning of when people were starting to, you know, judge gaming as damaging and harmful, and the sort of social dialogue about that has really taken off in the last 12 years. So there's a lot more judgment around it now than there probably was then, because it was still in its infancy then. So over the next few years, my fears actually grew more. And just to give you some idea of the sort of fears that came up for me, I feared the amount of inactivity that was involved. So I feared that my children's physical development would somehow be hampered, you know, that possibly their eyesight, or that they just wouldn't get enough exercise. that they would get overweight or unfit. I had fears about their learning falling behind their peers, or just generally their learning not developing in the way it should if they were playing lots of games, which they were. I had a lot of fears about what other people might think of my children playing a lot of video games. I feared the judgments coming from my parents and other people I knew who were limiting games and screen time. I feared that there might be some harm to their brain development. I feared the violent content in the games, and that, that it might potentially make them more violent. And there was a lot of the games that they were interested in were first-person shooters or platforming games where they had to kill lots of baddies and bosses and level up and all that sort of stuff. So that was a concern way back then, and I feared that they would be influenced by their peers in various ways, online. And anyway, there were lots of different fears. So I had a judgment about gaming not being like a worthwhile activity, and I had a whole stack of fears. And I also had two sons that were absolutely passionate about gaming and about spending their time on screens, in particular playing video games. And so that put me in a very, very difficult situation. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of stress for me around that. And partly that was because of all these fears and worries that were going on in my head, but it was also because of the personalities of my sons, that they were extremely determined and just very, very clear about what they wanted to do and how much they enjoyed it and why they wanted to do it. And that was, so their passion for this activity was coming up against my fears and my stress. And that had the potential to generate a lot of conflict in our family, a great deal of conflict. So I really felt I needed to examine what was going on. And I didn't decide to go down the path of limiting their screen time. Instead, I decided to go down the path of questioning my thinking about it. So to actually investigate my fears and to investigate my beliefs and my conditioned thinking around screen time. And that really made a huge difference. So really what I want to talk to you about today is about the process that I went through to question my thinking. It's about a process of investigation that I went through, and the process is important. So it's a process that I want to guide you through by giving you the example of how I question my thinking about gaming, because I want you to learn this process. I want you to be able to apply this process to whatever's coming up in your head and to find your own answers. I mean, obviously you can follow along my process and you might find you have very much the same sort of thoughts as I do, but the process is really important, and it can be applied to so many different things that is what I really want you to get out of this this webinar most of all, is a familiarity with this process. Now, the process has a name. It's called the work. It was designed by a woman called Byron Katie, and it's actually just a series of questions. that you ask yourself about any thought or belief that is bringing stress into your life. So the first part involves actually just identifying, noticing what you're thinking, identifying the thought that you're going to question. So one way of doing this is to basically listen to what you're saying to your children. So if you're saying things that are judgmental of gaming, for example, or you're judging your children for wanting to be on screens or YouTube or gaming or whatever it is they're doing, just listening to what you're saying and then writing it down and using that as a way to pin down what you're actually thinking and believing. So it might be something like, you shouldn't be doing that all day, or something like that, okay, that it's got a judgment attached to it. The thought that I'm going to use as an example for you is my thought that playing video games all day will harm my children. So this is not something that I was saying to them, it's just something that was in my mind. So in my mind was the thought, if they play video games all day, it's going to harm them. All right, so I'm going to use that, and I'm going to apply these 4 questions that Byron Katie uses, and I'm going to give you my answers. All right, so I'm basically going to go through this process of inquiry, and you can follow along with me. And then at the same time, you might actually be thinking of your own thought that you can actually also use the questions at the same time or afterwards, after the seminar. So I will see if I can just bring up the questions on the screen, and then you can follow along. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so can you see that? Yep. Okay, so these are the questions that there's 4 questions, and there's sort of sub-questions within that. So the thought that I had was, playing video games all day will harm my children. And the first question, you just give a simple yes or no answer. So is that true? Is it true that playing video games all day will harm them? And when I really went within and found the answer for myself, I thought, well, I don't actually know. I don't know whether it's going to harm them. So you just leave it at that. You listen to whatever answer arises from within you, and then you listen. Second question, can you absolutely know it's true? Could I absolutely know it was true that playing video games all day was going to harm my children? And the answer to that was no. I couldn't absolutely know it was true that playing video games was going to harm them. So we move to question 3. How do you feel when you believe the thought? So how did I feel when I believed the thought that playing video games all day would harm my children? Well, I felt very, very stressed, as I've already said, because I had all these fears around the possible harm and this judgment that I thought video gaming was somehow bad or not worthwhile. It wasn't a worthwhile activity. And not only was it not worthwhile, but it was potentially harmful. So I was very stressed. And what happened when that was going on in my head, that was like thoughts and images, and there was stories going on in my mind about what might happen in the future if this kept going. So it was sort of like this projection of all this fear into the future, and this imagined future where you know, they would be unhealthy and they would be violent and they would be, you know, just not in a good place, right? So that was sort of running in my head, and that was driving me to try and control my children. So how I felt when I believed that thought was I wanted to stop them. You know, I wanted to somehow control or limit their activity, their gaming. And that was bringing me into conflict with my children because I was getting angry. You know, if you go down the path of trying to control your children and they're resisting, then there's conflict. And my children were resisting. You know, they weren't going to be limited. They weren't going to have a bar of that. So there would have been a massive conflict. And so that then brought me up against my own anger and disapproval. And then when there was, I couldn't see a way of peacefully or reasonably limiting their gaming without this massive conflict, then the self-judgment kicked in. So if I couldn't control them, if I couldn't, you know, limit this, if there was going to be this huge battle and this fight, then there's this massive self-judgment sort of started up about how I wasn't a good enough parent, you know, and how I was negligent and I was letting my children go down this path that was going to lead to some sort of terrible future. So there was all this guilt and effectively beating up on myself because I believed these fears and these judgments about gaming and that I should somehow try and control it, and yet my children, you know, wanted to keep doing it. So there was a huge amount of stress internally within me, stress and conflict and guilt and self-judgment going on inside of me that was leaking out in my family, leaking out and affecting my relationship with my children. So what I was actually experiencing when I was believing the thought that playing video games will harm my children was my relationship with them was being harmed. Not by the video games, but by the thinking I was having about the video games. So my relationship with them was being harmed, and my relationship with myself was being harmed because there was all this self-judgment going on at the same time. So the fourth question then is, who would you be without that thought? Who would I be there in the house with my sons playing video games without the thought, playing video games all day will harm my children? Well, when I asked myself that question, who would I be without that thought? And I imagined myself there with my sons playing games, it was just all absolutely fine. They were sitting having a great time, and they were happy for me to be involved, and they were happy to share their enjoyment with me. And without the thought that it would harm them, I could actually just enjoy the moment and relax and actually observe them and what they were doing and what they were engaged with and connect with them. That's the big thing. I could actually just be with them, feel connected to them and their enjoyment when I didn't have that thought. So that was a very interesting insight when I asked that question of myself. So there is another element to the process. Once you've asked those 4 questions, then you go to what Byron Katie calls the turnaround. And this is where you look to see whether the opposite of what you believed is also true. So there are various different ways you can turn this around, but the direct opposite would be playing video games all day will not harm my children. So you look at the opposite And then you investigate to see what evidence is there to see if that is also true, that it will not harm my children. And when I actually investigated this, the evidence was very clear that it wasn't harming my children, because my children were fine, and they always have been in relation to gaming. There was just no problem. They were having a really, really good time. They were learning heaps. They were jumping up and down with excitement. They were making friends. They were building social skills. They were building confidence. They were even, you know, getting up and going outside from time to time to exercise. So there didn't actually seem to be any problem in reality that I could detect. So that was very interesting to make that observation, direct observation, that I didn't seem to be harming them at all. So the other turnaround that I thought of when I looked at it was my thinking about video games will harm my children, or at least my relationship with my children. And that was also true. So my thinking about all the fears and everything that were going on in my head about them, that was actually causing a big problem in my relationship with my children. That was more likely to harm them than the video games. The damage of me putting all my fears, projecting all of that onto them and trying to control them, I felt was more likely to be harmful than the actual playing of the video games. So that was a bit of a wake-up call too. So once I'd actually gone through this process, it really opened my mind to the fact that perhaps it was just all this learnt information and conditioned sort of programming that was coming into my mind that was causing my stress and causing this conflict. And when I looked really clearly at what was actually happening with my children, I didn't see any evidence of harm. In fact, I saw the reverse. I saw evidence of great benefit from their gaming and their screen time. So it really opened my eyes, and it really opened my mind to a new perspective. And I also did other research. It wasn't just that process that changed my perspective. I also did a lot of reading about the benefits of video gaming and the approach other home educators had taken to gaming and letting their children have unlimited screen time. So I did a lot of reading about it as well, and continued to have an open mind about it. So rather than actually have a fixed idea, I wanted to actually have an open mind and actually look at the evidence in front of me in terms of what my children were actually doing and how they were and how they were engaging with this method of learning, which is essentially what it is. They were learning all the time as they were playing video games. So after going through this process of doing these questions and doing this reading, I decided that I wasn't going to limit them in any way in terms of the time they spent on video games, and also that I was actually going to actively engage with their gaming. So I was going to join in as much as possible. I'm actually a hopeless gamer. Because I just didn't have any background in it. I'm really, really bad at it. But they thought that was absolutely incredibly funny, and they loved having me participate just so I could die all over the place, you know, and just be hopeless. They just thought it's the funniest thing ever to have mum join and just get trashed, you know. So so I just went along with it, you know, for their amusement, essentially. But I also spent a lot of time watching them play and helping them, you know, figure out how to play, because they played a lot of different games, and the amount of learning involved in figuring out how these games are played, and the problem solving, and the, you know, reading heaps of instruction manuals, and learning computer skills, and because we graduated off the PlayStation onto PCs, and they've both now got big gaming PCs, and I had to learn from scratch, you know, how to operate a PC computer and how to do mods on Minecraft and all this incredible tech stuff. You know, I was the tech support, so we were all on a really, really steep learning curve. And because I was involved and I was watching and sometimes playing with them, I could observe what they were learning, and I could observe, you know, any difficulties they got into. I was right there beside them. You know, they were always playing right in the middle of our living room, and everything was just completely open, you know. So I would be privy to all the gaming conversations, and everything that was happening right in front of me, and I was involved. So if there were any difficulties, I was right there to offer help. I was right there to offer food. I was right there to suggest we have a break and go outside and jump on the trampoline or go to the park or whatever. And because I was sort of with them, you know, a partner in this whole enterprise, there wasn't any conflict. There was just suggestions. Oh, perhaps you'd like to do this, or perhaps you'd like to try that, or perhaps we should have a break. And, you know, they were really open to that. They were really open to my input, because I wasn't judging what they were doing. I wasn't in opposition to what they were doing. I was just there as sort of part of the team, you know. And it was really an amazing time. And I had a lot of fun. They had a lot of fun. And I don't have any regrets at all about that time. And it went on for 10 years. Their really serious passion for gaming. And then they just kind of grew out of it. So they're 18 and 14 now, and they hardly ever, well, not hardly ever, they probably get on and play games maybe for 2 or 3 hours a week at the most. And they've got they've got lots of other interests now. So they still like gaming, but it's way down on the list of things that they're really into. So yeah, it was a really amazing time, and they have survived and thrived, and it's worked out really, really well for all of us. And it's actually brought us together and really solidified and strengthened our relationship, that I was sort of part of that process and that time of their lives. So there were still a few things that we had to sort out, and one of the other things that we also had to learn was the process of problem solving when there were difficulties, and particularly around bedtimes. There were some problems because they were in the living room, and, you know, other family, myself and my husband, needed to sleep sometimes when they were wanting to stay up. So we actually had a process of problem solving which involved all members of the family to find solutions that we were all happy with around bedtimes. And, you know, when games should be turned off, when people would go into their bedrooms, and we'd have sort of quiet time in the family. But we all participated as equal participants in that process of finding solutions that everybody in the family could be happy with. And it was an ongoing process. you know, because circumstances changed in the family regularly. So we would often come back to that process to figure out what the best way forward, you know, what the best solution would be at any particular time. So the two things I'd like you to take away from this, I suppose, is that this process of questioning your thinking, using these questions, can be applied to any stressful situation, any stress, any situation in your family that's causing you stress or is causing conflict. It can be applied to screen time, to gaming, but to all sorts of other things as well. And there are other skills you can sort of back this up with, like a problem-solving process that you can involve your children in. So these are, they're tools, if you like, that you can use to support your journey with your children and to have a really peaceful and to have a life with them that is not full of stress and struggle, essentially, that's more peaceful, that's more relaxed, and where you actually value the quality of your relationships, because you're actually able to question the fears and judgments that get in the way of relationships so often. So these are skills that I also teach in my Joyful Parenting course. That's a 6-week course based on the book that I wrote and published a few years ago called Joyful Parenting. So the process of questioning your thinking and the process of problem solving are just 2 of the modules in this 6-week course that starts in 2 weeks' time on the 24th of July. So if you're interested in learning more about this process of questioning your thinking or the process of problem solving, I'd love you to join us. I'm going to put up on the screen some, here we go. There's just a little detail. Oh, no, wrong screen. Let me try that again. Here we go. There's, no, still wrong screen. Okay, well, I'm going to give up on that. Here we go. So, yeah, it's just got my website address, www.freydawson.com.au, where you can find details of the Joyful Parenting course. And you can also, if you go to the homepage there, you can enter your email address and you can download for free the first 50 pages of my book, Joyful Parenting. So if you can check it out and have a read and see if you find it interesting. And there's also lots of free articles on lots of different topics on my website. So I'd love you to have a look at that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop recording and